I beg you to try it, Patricia.
Let me get this straight, Carla. You disagree on the weapon, you disagree on the number of blows?
Listen to me, Patricia. You were there once in your life.
Hey people, Trish Wood here, and you are listening to this show while I am in beautiful Quebec, Nova Scotia, at the Free Speech in Medicine conference. So I recorded this actually a week ago. So there may be huge things that have happened in the week preceding the show that I don't mention. Don't think I didn't know about them. It just meant we had to do a pre-record. We try and stay as current as we can, obviously, especially since we do a fair bit of news on the show. But I had to pre-record so I could get away and get. Quebec is kind of remote, right? Like it's like an hour and a bit out of Sydney. So these are not easy places to get to, and I feel fantastic about that because it's such a pretty little town. Very much like the town of Lurich on the island of Shetland. If you watch that show, that opening shot of the town, that's what Quebec looks like. A little fishing village kind of built up a hill. Gorgeous. I'm so looking forward to it. I can't even tell you. But anyway, so this show is a pre-record. But I know that one thing that will not have changed, and that is the absolute and total relevance of the conference I'm doing or will be doing, and what has happened to us recently. It's been a very, very strange time. Let me tell you first who our guest is. Our guest today is someone I've wanted to speak to for a very, very long time. Her name is Dr. Tess Lawrie, and we reached her in the UK, which is where she works. She's been a very, very vocal and brave person, heretic in a sense. She's been critical of vaccines and other COVID policies. And, I think like other people, she's paid a price for it. But what's interesting about her and what you'll hear in the interview is that we get into a fair bit of personal stuff. As two women who've been on the kind of difficult side of this argument, it's hard, right? Like I have anxiety now that I didn't have before. I don't understand the world the way I thought I did before. I'm no longer innocent about some things. And I was an investigative reporter. I knew a lot of bad stuff, right? But boy, this has really turned my view of the world upside down. And I believe Dr. Lawrie's too. So we talk about that. She said something that really I found gobsmacking. I just asked her kind of off the cuff, would you homeschool your kids now based on what we know about vaccines and all the other crazy stuff going on in schools? And she said, yes, she would. I think the homeschooling thing is going to grow and grow and grow and grow because we've lost control as parents and citizens over what's going on in classrooms. So that was interesting. The other thing she said that you should watch for, especially about, given what I'm going to say to you in a second about where we are in vaccines, is that we can continue to publish and publicize all of these vaccine studies that are showing harm, and not only harm, but also a waning efficacy in these shots. In other words, the risk-benefit ratio is completely blown at this point. But we have to start accepting that as a truth, right? Like, I don't think we need to keep piling stuff up because we've proven the case. And for reasons that we cannot explain, they're not listening and they're getting away with it. And part of that equation is something that I've been saying to you folks since this show went on the air. Everything wrong in the world right now is because we don't have a critical legacy media holding the people in power to account. Think about that for a minute. Not to kind of browbeat the issue, but it is true on every front. Politicians now, regulators now, even people who are mean to us, who own grocery stores or whatever, just out in the world, they all know that no one's ever going to hold them accountable for anything, right? They can do whatever they want. They know that now. They know the legacy media is not going to hold them accountable. So once that happens, then the world becomes a very, very dangerous place. And certainly it ceases being a democracy. And I will say it on this show, we no longer live in a democracy because I think the truckers showed us, this is what the Prime Minister was afraid of. I think the truckers showed us that most Canadians actually do not believe what the government is doing. And yet somehow we keep ending up with these globalist governments who don't represent the people and don't care to represent the people. So these are some of the things that we were talking about, Tess Lawrie and I, and she says, we've passed the point where we have to kind of highly publicize everything. We've proven it. So what do we do now? So we do talk about that. I'm going to play for you a piece of tape that I believe, to steal a phrase, will live in infamy. And by the time you hear this, it will have been a week ago. For me, it's just like yesterday, so I'm still really fired up about it. That's why I'm playing it. This is the CDC video of their panel of doctors agreeing to include the COVID-19 vaccine in the program of other more reliable vaccinations and more studied vaccinations, ones we accept, most of us, including it in that program, right? It makes no sense. The risk-benefit ratio does not add up. Children do not die of COVID-19 unless they're already compromised, and those kids could be vaccinated if, in fact, we believe it stops transmission. I don't think it does. Well, it doesn't. Why is the CDC going ahead with this? We have to ask ourselves, why are we vaccinating kids who don't need it when the data is showing harm and not just myocarditis? Why are we doing it? I want you to listen to this tape, and it will, as I said, it'll live in infamy as these people say their names and are voting yes to include the COVID-19 shot.
Everybody in? Thank you very much. We'll proceed with the vote. So as a reminder, please state your name, whether you have any conflicts of interest, and your vote. And I'm going to start right now with Dr. Bell.
Bell, no conflicts, yes.
Thank you. Ms. McNally.
McNally, no conflicts, yes.
Thank you. Dr. Lair.
Lair, no conflicts, yes.
Ms. Bata.
Bata, no conflicts, yes.
Dr. Brooks.
Brooks, no conflicts, yes.
Dr. Daly.
Daly, no conflicts, yes.
Dr. Sanchez.
Sanchez, no conflict, yes.
Dr. Shaw.
Shaw, no conflicts, yes.
Dr. Long.
Long, no conflict, yes.
Dr. Cotton.
Cotton, no conflicts, yes.
Dr. Sineas.
Sineas, no conflicts, yes.
Dr. Paling.
Paling, no conflict, yes.
Lee, no conflicts, yes. Dr. Talbot.
Talbot, no conflicts, yes.
Dr. Chen.
Chen, no conflicts, yes.
Thank you. Dr. Morton.
And the motion passed 15 unanimously in favor.
Thank you, everyone. We can now put our cameras off, and we will proceed with the next session.
So, for me, that clip represents the end. I don't mean to be too dramatic, but it kind of represents the end of science. There is no logical or scientific or numeric or data-driven basis to subject kids to this vaccine. Look, in Denmark, I believe it's Denmark, they're not even giving it to people under the age of 50, right? They're not. They've stopped. How is the science different in North America, in DC? Probably, I think the CDC building is actually in Maryland. But how is the science different there? And what should be happening in the world that isn't is that those people who voted yes should be being called to account by journalists saying, well, given that kids don't die of COVID unless they've got serious comorbidities, why are we vaccinating them with a shot that doesn't have any long-term safety data and the stuff we're seeing looks scary? Why? No one's asking that question. That's how they get away with it. But for me, the bigger question is, and anybody who listens to the show knows this by now, I just kind of wonder what's wrong with these people, dare I say it, mentally? Like, On what basis? How, as functioning human beings first and scientists second, are they risking these shots on kids who won't benefit from them anyway? Explain it to me. Somebody, please explain it to me. And why aren't they asking them to explain themselves? And I'll point out to you, actually, Tucker Carlson said this. I noticed it too. A couple of the people on that Zoom meeting that you just heard saying, yes, no conflicts of interest, were wearing masks in their own houses on a Zoom meeting. So, not exactly critical thinkers. But these are now the people who populate the scientific community on that side. And we have to be aware of it because, and this is why I'm going out to the Free Speech and Medicine Conference. That's why I'm not going out, that's why I'm here by the time you hear this. Because this is what groupthink and censorship and fear-mongering, that doctors can't tell the truth about what they see, this is what you get. You get a committee of apparently well-educated, learned doctors approving a vaccine for kids, not approving, but approving for being part of a protocol. And I believe in some states, unless they opt out, this will be a mandated shot. They're not just saying, okay, for kids, yeah, if you want. That exists now. That what they're doing is they're including it in shots that are mandated for school attendance. So, right? I mean, what the heck? And this is, as I say, this is what happens when scientists are either not allowed to think for themselves or are so corrupted by groupthink and politics and ideology. This is what you get. And folks, it is dangerous and we've got to stop it. And that is one of the reasons I'm where I am this weekend. The other interesting thing that happened around vaccines was Aseem Malhotra's appearance on Laura Ingraham. We have a clip of that too. Let me just say who he is because we talked about him on the Joseph Freeman show. Joseph Freeman did this big analysis of adverse reactions, a published study, peer-reviewed, that found many serious adverse reactions and injuries actually from the shots, right? So on that show, it was the same week that Aseem Malhotra, a cardiologist in the UK, had released a study, more of a kind of review of the literature, in which he was so perturbed by what he saw that he was demanding that the shots be stopped altogether until we know more and can see all the data, which is a perfectly logical thing for a curious person to ask for. Everything is so secret right now. Why is that? Why did our prime minister buy, 96 million or 90 million COVID vaccine shots? Most people don't want them, and they're certainly not vaccinating their kids. And just as an aside, here he was last week with Premier Ford making allusions to the fact that he may mandate again or something. I don't know what he was talking about, but people don't want them. And the people who don't want them because they don't work and they're dangerous. So what's he going to do with these shots that he's got, right? Anyway, so Aseem Malhotra, back to Laura Ingraham. His father, Aseem Malhotra, had been a big booster of vaccines, pardon the pun, and was appearing on BBC to push the vaccines and was a little bit snarky with the so-called anti-vax crowd until his father died following a vaccination with the COVID-19 shot of a heart issue. So he educated himself. Now he's very frightened of them and is asking that the shots be stopped. We did talk about this a little bit a couple of weeks ago, and also we'll talk about it a bit too when we get to Tess Lawrie. In the interview with Tess Lawrie, right off the top, she talks about Malhotra, Dr. Malhotra. You will have heard a little bit of that clip in the previous show, but don't worry, it's not a replay interview. It's all fresh material after that, so hang in. But I want to play for you his appearance on Laura Ingraham this week.
That data suggested at the time it was likely to cause more harm than good in most people. And that's a smoking gun. That's more than enough evidence for us to pause and stop the vaccine rollout. So myocarditis is one issue. The other very good, clear data actually reveals that in people aged between 16 and 39, Israel data showed this, there was a 25% absolute increase in heart attacks and cardiac arrest, which was associated with the vaccine, but not associated with COVID. This has now been replicated in Florida, a similar type of findings recently, and that's why the general surgeon of Florida has come out and suggested that certainly people in that age group shouldn't be having the vaccine. But I've looked at that data, I've spoken to the researchers in Israel, and in fact, this signal of harm is for everybody, even people over the age of 60, not to that degree.
Well, Doctor, let me jump in here and just very quickly. Given what we know thus far, was this vaccine rolled out too quickly without adequate testing because of the global pandemic nature of things?
I think yes, but Laura, I find it very difficult to believe that Pfizer senior executives and Pfizer scientists didn't know when it was being rolled out, because they have access to the raw data, which we now know shows significant harm. It's likely they knew this, which means that I don't think it probably, with hindsight, and I'm sure an investigation will reveal this eventually, it probably should never have been rolled out in the first place.
Wow. If this is the case, this is a global scandal. We've been covering this from almost day one. A global scandal.
Yeah.
I mean, it's as big as it gets.
No, it is. I think, Laura, we are, this is perhaps the greatest miscarriage of medical science, attack on democracy, damage to population health, an erosion of trust in medicine that we will witness in our lifetime. I'm speaking in the British Parliament on Thursday on this to members of the British Parliament to present this data. They need to act now and stop this from continuing to cause more harm. The longer it goes on, the more damage is going to be done, the longer it's going to take to regain trust.
Dr. Malhotra, this is just invaluable. We really appreciate your courage and speaking out.
So a couple of things spring to mind when I'm listening to Dr. Aseem Malhotra talking to Laura Ingram about that. And that is the silence on behalf of everybody else. They seem, did the CDC panel that reviewed the vaccine for children, did they look at Dr. Malhotra's work? Did they call him and say, we want to consult with you? None of that seems to be happening. They don't address the criticisms. And at this point, I believe that the vaccines have become a kind of mass hysteria response that even if Bill Gates himself or even Tony Fauci himself came forward, like Jim Jones from the People's Temple, and said, we've got to stop the vaccines, I think these kind of mid-level scientific bureaucrats would still believe in it and still make us get it. It's, the idea that this is based in any way on data or truth or rational thinking or critical thinking is gone, right? The people who are now pushing this vaccine on children, I'm telling you that there's something wrong with them, because the data, there's no data that supports their decision, including, their big argument is, well, if kids get COVID, they don't die from it, but they can get myocarditis too. So that is just like, if you total up who gets what from what when, this is not a threat. The threat of myocarditis from COVID in children does not outweigh the threat of myocarditis for children from the vaccine. It just doesn't. But that's what they fall back on, and that is not true, and that shows sloppy thinking. So you have to, this is why everybody's becoming a conspiracy theorist, right? How do you explain it? How do you explain what has happened to people in the science and medical communities? I can't, except that there have been periods in history of groupthink and various professions being taken over by some kind of hysterical reaction, or maybe it's lefty. I don't know what it is, but it's very, very dangerous. So I want to tell you now, before I do our pitch, that we have a very, very special extra today. That's what we call my little sign off. It's going to be longer than usual. And it's going to be longer than usual because I want to remind you and bring back to the forefront of your moving through your daily life the uplifting nature of the Freedom Convoy. We've all been talking about how the Emergencies Act hearings have been so absurd and farcical and ludicrous to the point where people are saying it was a microaggression. I mean, nothing they said was true. We know that. I said that on the show because I did the investigative work, as has True North and other smart people. Rebel News have done some too, and the National Post have done some work. We knew that there was no justification for it, and that the hearings would find none, that there's no amount of kind of verbal gymnastics that these people under oath can say to produce things that did not happen, right? They can't do it. They can't do it. And that makes the Emergencies Act even worse. But getting to my earlier point, that the media will not hold Prime Minister Trudeau to account, nor will the opposition parties, because they were all in on it too, right? They hate the working class. I suspect nothing will come of it, except that we already know it was a farce, which we knew anyway. So what I'm doing at the end of the show today is I'm just playing some lovely tapes of people talking about what the convoy meant to them. I didn't put these together, other people have, but I think it's worth listening to, because then we can really understand for sure what we've lost. And more importantly, one of Canada's, in my view, most important novelists, who I'm not going to reveal here yet, we'll talk about him later, has made a submission, a personal submission to the Emergencies Act hearings about his experience of the convoy. This is a person that I have been exchanging emails with for quite a long time. He reached out to me and wanted to kind of stay private for a while, and so we did. He sent me some books. I don't tend to read a lot of nonfiction because I read so much for work that is nonfiction, but I took his books away with me to the cabin in the woods just after my dog Katie died, and said, no, I'm not going to research the show. I'm just going to sit in the woods and read a book. And he's a terrific writer, an amazing writer. He deserves every accolade. But the other interesting thing about this person supporting the convoy in the most articulate, beautiful way is that they cannot come at him for being a hillbilly, right? When I read you his educational history, his creative history as a writer, the awards, I mean, it's like he's off the charts smart, right? And he's written this beautiful, beautiful letter in defense of the convoy. So I'm going to read it to you and reveal who he is right after our Tess Lawrie interview. So here's my pitch. I'll keep it short. We are reader supported, and you can do that if you're so inclined, and we're always grateful to people who do. So we don't put any of the shows behind a paywall. I think we've done it maybe once or twice in the history of the show. And maybe I'm shooting myself in the foot here, but I always feel that what we're doing is so important that I don't want the person who can't afford it to not be able to have access to it. That's why we've made supporting the show voluntary, so that the people who can afford $5 or $10 a month can support it for the people who maybe can't do that. And there's lots of people who are struggling now, and more, obviously, with the economy tanking. So that's why we don't do that. And, I hear from lots of people that I should, but originally it was just because it was such important medical advice in the middle of a pandemic, and the idea that we were creating a community for people. But now I still feel that what we're doing is really important, and that people should be able to access it if they can afford it. They can chip in. If they can't, that's fine. And maybe we will start doing ads soon, which will take some of that stress off of us. But here's how you do it. Go to my website, which is trishwoodpodcast.com. There's a support button. It gives you options: Patreon, PayPal, Substack. I prefer Substack because they are a free speech platform, and we're trying to move everybody over. But if you'd rather do Patreon, feel free. But we are going to move people over. So the other thing is we've got new merch coming out. I'm doing some merch to reflect our coverage of the trans extremist movement, which we've done a few shows on now, and really from kind of the women's point of view. So we're going to have two hats. One of them is just going to say woman on the baseball cap, and the other one is going to say #AdultHumanFemale. So for the women who listen to the show, and I know there's a ton of you, that's another way to support us is going to look at our merch. We still have trucker merch in there. We, the Fringe, has always been a big seller. And our first hat, which was a hat that simply said no, as they were pushing more and more restrictions and vaccine mandates, etc., on us. So that's my housekeeping for today. Let's move on to Tess Lawrie. I want to play for you now, just before we get to Tess, because we talk about this. It's a very famous piece of video of she on a Zoom call with a colleague named Andrew Hill. They were tasked to do, a meta-analysis of the ivermectin numbers, and they both agreed, according to Tess, that it sounds like him too in this recorded Zoom call, that they thought that ivermectin was a pharmaceutical product that was making a difference in the outcomes of people. I don't remember. Well, let's just say. I think they'd agreed after doing a meta-analysis that ivermectin was having some very good results. But then, according to Tess, when the paper was published, it did not reflect what they had been discussing, and he'd been responsible for doing the final version of it. So she calls him on Zoom to question him about what happened, and it's quite an interesting phone call. And it is in keeping again with our theme of the show today, which has been, censorship in medicine and science and what is going on these days. I'm going to talk to Tess Lawrie about that in a minute, but here is my interview with her, and we will be discussing Dr. Aseem Malhotra off the top. Hi, Tess Lawrie. How are you?
I'm very well, thanks. How are you, Trish?
I'm very well. It's great to finally meet you. As I was saying a second ago, sort of off mic, that I've been following you for a very, very long time with quite a great deal of admiration. So it's nice to finally get a chance to talk to you, especially at this time, which I think is quite pivotal. But before we deep dive kind of your history around COVID, evidence-based medicine, where we're going and what we must do now, I want to talk to you about the study, the paper, I guess, written by Dr. Malhotra. It got quite a lot of attention, and you helped present it through a media briefing. Tell me the significance of it. Describe it for me. And what does it mean kind of in the pantheon of where we are now, ever collecting this negative and truthful information about vaccines?
Yeah, thanks, Trish. Well, it's two papers by Dr. Malhotra, Dr. Aseem Malhotra. And what is so important about these papers is really the context, because they're coming from a doctor who promoted the COVID-19 vaccines on the BBC and quite widely particularly to Black, Asian and Middle Eastern population in the UK. So it seems like early in 2021, there was, what they call vaccine hesitancy among this particular segment of society. And he was kind of recruited by the BBC to persuade them that the COVID vaccines were safe and effective, and it was in their interest to take the injections. So what's fascinating is that, and he received injections as well. I think he had two vaccinations, and then and his father was a very senior doctor and the vice chair at one point of the British Medical Association. So Dr. Malhotra is a well-respected cardiologist himself, and so and his father died as a result of the COVID vaccine, the COVID vaccine. So it was only after his father died that they did a post-mortem, because his father was a very fit man, and Aseem knew something was wrong, and so they did a post-mortem. And it showed that he had a really severe heart attack with clots and so on. That just didn't make sense. And so Aseem was forced to sort of go through on this personal journey actually look into the available the evidence on the vaccines. And you and I know that there are a lot of papers now and a lot of data on the pharmacovigilance databases that show unprecedented numbers of adverse reactions and also association with harm. So he's kind of gone on this journey. He's written it up. The papers themselves are quite personal, involve a lot of his personal story and his personal journey. And what is remarkable is just having this man, come forward from a position of promoting the jabs to now really fully convinced that the COVID vaccines are causing harm and that they must be recalled.
And he's calling for a pause, is he not?
Absolutely. He's saying they must be paused. We need a full independent evaluation. And he's also fully aware and speaking out about the likelihood of fraud in the Pfizer and other clinical trials. So it's really remarkable. And of course, the mainstream media, which were really using him in the first few months of COVID with the rollout of the injections, they're now discrediting him and so on.
See, this is, I was legacy media for 20, 30 years of my life. And watching these kind of things happen where they have an expert on who feeds their approved narrative. And if the expert changes their mind, somehow they're discredited, right? They were credible before, but now because they're not supporting the narrative, all of a sudden they're not reviving. Joseph Freeman, who did the other study that we're going to be talking about, well, we talked about it last week, which means this week, but Joseph Freeman was a lockdown supporter, and he's a guy who because he was a doc in Louisiana, treating a lot of poor patients who were quite sick from COVID. And he realized he was wrong and apologized for it. So to Jay Bhattacharya publicly, it was a lovely kind of spiritual moment, right? So, but the media, they have so much to answer for in this that they pick a doctor who says what they want them to say. And if he has a changed mind based on evidence, then he's just, discarded. It's shocking.
Yeah, well, I think, those of us who've been trying to get the news out to the public and help them both with respect to early treatment for COVID, as well as alerting them to the concerns regarding the COVID-19 vaccines, we pretty much know that the mainstream media are corporate media. They're corporate media and they are just serving the corporate agenda. And it's just a real struggle.
It's so blatant, I guess, Tess. They're not even trying to hide it now. It's just so obvious. So thank you for that. So I want to just roll back a little bit and maybe do, sort of the 300-foot view, looking at where we are now, but also how we got here. Because I'm assuming, perhaps like me, that you, although you were skeptical of science and the corporatization of it, did you ever expect you would live through an event like this in your lifetime?
No.
I mean, the corruption, right?
Yeah, I didn't think it was, I suppose if you talk about the corruption, certainly the last decade, I suppose I have been wondering just how we got here, because we were in such a materialist world, so highly competitive, so removed from nature, and it just and as you say, so corrupt. These authorities that don't seem to be elected, that don't seem to represent us. Wondering how did they get there? How did we end up with these idiots in charge? They don't care about us. And how do we change that? So I did have that feeling, but I certainly never thought we'd live through what I now believe is a kind of manufactured crisis, and what looks like an imminent financial collapse, and health system collapse and global government collapse and a big, attempted takeover by these corporations or whoever's running them.
It's weird, isn't it? I mean, I was, as a reporter, I reported around the edges of this. I did a lot of pharmaceutical products liability stories back in the day when media did those things. But I never expected we'd actually be where we are now. I felt there were times it kind of bubbled up, but then it would recede. And somehow COVID has just, it's kind of ushered in an era that I feel, is it too extreme for me to say is the beginning of the end of what we had even 5 years ago? Do you feel that way about it?
Yeah, I think, but that's not a bad thing. I think what people must realize also is that change is the one certain thing in life. The only certainty is that things change.
Yeah.
And we've had this, an empire's rise and fall and all of that. And we've had this very, very corporate driven empire for I don't know how many hundreds of years, and it's got to come to an end somehow. It's almost kind of burning out itself in some sort of meteoric fashion. It's going to take out a lot of people on the way, but when that happens, there's the birth of something new. So, to cycle, I listened to a really interesting, I went to a meeting, unfortunately, I don't remember the name of the chap who spoke about this, but he was saying that, you have there's sort of three types of leadership. There's sort of an intellectual leadership, there's a merchant leadership, and there's a warrior leadership. And these things sort of, go in cycles or ebbs and flows. So we passed the peak of the merchant, and it's kind of fizzling out. And the next leadership, according to this chap, was warrior leadership, and I don't think that means war. I think it means really stepping back into personal sovereignty and remembering that we're free. So I think it's going to be quite an interesting time, seeing a change, because we're certainly going to see it, and I think it's inevitable that. That this materialist sort of system that we've been living through would just fizzle itself out, because but it seems like the corporates are just trying to take as much as they can, as fast as they can.
I had a really strange thought yesterday. I was walking home and I was thinking that I needed to buy a new jacket. And the jacket I like, it's actually an English jacket with a waxed kind of exterior. And you see it in a lot of pictures, like Prince Charles would be wearing it about, the one I mean, it's kind of like same color. Yeah, same color as your sweater, right? And it's that wax, yeah. And I thought, well, they're about $600 now or something like that. And my mind was just going, I thought, having quality things now too is really expensive. Back in the day, you could buy quality sheets that were cotton and clothing that was well made and boots. Like now everything is kind of cheap and cheerful, and we have to accept that. Or if we want something that has quality, it's ridiculously expensive. And obviously, I don't live for objects, but I feel that that's kind of diminished our quality of life too. I remember really good sheets. My grandmother used to iron cotton sheets, right?
Yeah.
And I feel that there is a big divide coming about who gets what and how that works out. And if you're not way in the top, everything you're going to get now, including government and medicine and healthcare and sheets, is not going to be very good. That's my feeling about where we're going now.
Well, certainly, that's... I don't know how familiar you are with the World Economic Forum and their spokespeople, but there is this mindset amongst, the handful that are controlling us, and that have this, I'm just going to call it an evil agenda, really. There is this mindset that we are just hackable animals, just cattle to be prodded and whatever. And I'm not sure if you saw that interview with Yuval Noah Harari, who's the chief scientist or something, where he basically says, he doesn't really know what they'll do with the rest of us who are just useless eaters, probably just put us on drugs and give us video games to play. So,
they've already done that, right? They've already done it. This generation, I see it in my kids. We're doing I've grown male children who game more than they should, and they're on their phones way more than I'd like. And I have a lot of shame as a parent about that I kind of let that happen.
No, I actually share that. It caused me enormous distress, that guilt, because, and, it kind of in a way led to my waking up, and is because I also just, I was working like crazy, just long hours traveling with work, and it just seems like, I don't know about you, but one income, two income family just doesn't seem to be enough now. I don't know how many incomes you need to actually, keep a roof over everyone's heads and have food on the table and all that stuff. It just seems to change all the time now with the energy bills going up. There's just no end to the pressure on families. So when I've got 3 adult children now, but they were teenagers, and I was working like crazy, and it just felt totally unsustainable. But I also felt like I'd outsourced my parenting to the school, and which is the educational system is absolutely broken, and to technology, because they're just spending so much time on their laptops and their phones. And it was so disempowering. And for a mother, and I empathize with you as well, you just feel like such a failure, haven't been able to protect our children from this this really untested intervention. If you think about it, I mean, there was no scientific studies done on. In fact, there were some scientific studies that showed that spending too long on a mobile phone or on laptops and that were had negative impacts on children's health and well-being and psychological well-being, and all of that was completely ignored years ago, but not least, it really exacerbated during COVID, when they said, okay, well, we'll just have all the lessons, all classes on Zoom. And, so it just has completely dehumanized our children. But just to say, you've reminded me of that feeling of, I'm glad they're adults now, but that feeling of just like having no control, no parental influence on one's beautiful children.
Beautiful kids. Well, and I've got 2 boys, and they're quite different in age. One is now 40, and one I had him when I was super young, and then the other one is 23, who I had him when I was quite old. I was 43 when I had him. And they kind of bookend the propulsion of digital technology into young lives, right? With my oldest boy, I probably could have done more. With Truman, by that time, 23 years ago, the horse was out of the barn by the time he was 10, 12. And, I thought about fighting. His dad and I were divorced, and I thought about fighting against the cell phone, but every other kid in the school had one. So then you're doing the calculation. Am I the weirdo parent who doesn't let my kid have a cell phone, and I limit TV, and he doesn't know, So you give in. You think you're kind of being noble, but you give in probably because you're also busy. But I feel like we were swept away. And I do also think, and I'll say this to you so you don't feel too bad about it, what was known then was not released to us then. So I learned 2 years ago that Facebook knew it was addictive and actually told their programmers, oh boy, if kids are getting addicted to the clicks and the likes, make it more so, right? So we didn't know that. I mean, I'm sure if somebody had said to either one of us, the kids are going to get addicted on these things, we would have maybe fought harder, but maybe I'm just...
But also the software that is being used and implemented in schools is learning software. So they are learning from, the software is learning, AI is learning from our children's facial expressions and interactions with the work. So, it can't be more alarming in terms of the future of humanity, not just the impact on the children, but the impact on the entire future of humanity, because, the World Economic Forum and that corporate mindset really has in mind to replace human beings to a large extent with AI. They want us just to continue being passive eaters
of bugs. Yeah. Well, my husband and I are now, we have this rule now that we cannot automatically go for our Google on the iPhone if we can't answer a question, if we have a memory fault, right? Because what we've done, we've outsourced our memory. And I feel this is probably existing in scientific literature somewhere, but I believe intuitively that it's true, that we've relied on Google to answer things we can't remember for so long that I think that our memory processing has changed. We've actually outsourced our processing to the Google platform. So now I don't do, if I'm at a dinner party and someone says like, what's the capital of Kuwait again? And I'm like, oh, I don't know. Normally I'm just grabbing the phone and I'm looking, but now I make myself, we make ourselves try to reconnect with that, because I think the machines have changed us. I'm reading a book now about focus, how we've lost, Ian McEwan he's one of my favorite English writers. And I'm like struggling to get through the novel because I'm distracted and I have less attention. And I think this is all kind of pulling us into something. Just to ask you this, and then I'll move back into COVID, because I don't want to lose too much time. But would you homeschool now?
Yes, I would.
Yeah, me too.
Definitely. I would quit my job now and I would look after my children.
Yeah, me too. I know. Oh, what a terrible thing to say and to realize, right? My oldest kid too has pretty serious learning disabilities that they were useless at handling. So he went to an expensive private school that was even worse. I mean, they just made it. Yeah. So homeschooling. Yes. Okay. So I want to get back to COVID. I want to know, this kind of an historic question for you, Tess Lawrie. When did you, in fact, did you have a big moment, even with your experience of knowing how dysfunctional the system is, did you have a big moment at the beginning of this that you said to yourself, COVID is going to be a shit show of public policy. They're going to blow this. Did you have that realization?
Yeah.
Yeah. When was it?
Yeah, it was probably around about January, February 2020. Before it was announced, there was something very wrong with what was going on, with what came out of China, what was on the news, about COVID and this, and I just knew there was something happening, something big happening, and then of course when they declared a pandemic and there was no evidence to suggest a pandemic. I thought, okay, here we go. And then we just saw the most ridiculous policies being rolled out and vaccine trials being done in 3 months. And in actual fact, I don't know if you've seen this clip by Dr. June Rain, who's the head of the UK Medicines Health Regulation Authorities, but she's giving a lecture in Oxford, which is her alma mater, and she says, we did such a great job with the COVID vaccines. We had this very flexible approach, and basically she shows before they finished the animal studies, they started the phase 1 studies in humans, and then before the phase 1 studies were finished, they started the phase 2, and before the phase 2, the phase 3, and then they just rolled it out to everybody. So she basically describes in this slide presentation that they never waited at any point to show whether the vaccines were safe before moving on to the next phase. And you wonder why we're in a position where, there's no evidence to support that these injections are safe or effective, but let's just go with safe, shall we, for now?
Yeah. Well, so as someone who studies human behavior, I always wonder about what's in her head. Like, it's obvious for you to see and for me to see that there's a problem that's dangerous for human beings in what she's doing. So my question to you, obviously it's hypothetical, what is in her head while she's revealing how dangerous the thing is that she's a part of and not understanding how dangerous it is?
I don't know. I actually can't answer that question. I just don't know. I mean, on the 9th of June, 2021, I did a rapid, sort of urgent preliminary analysis of the UK's yellow card data. What the harms that had been reported in association with the COVID-19 vaccines? Because I thought if I could just look at it in a slightly different way, perhaps they would be able to or at least doctors would be able to see what the issue was. And at that time, and also because they were meeting to discuss rolling out to children on the 10th of June, 2021. And so, we did a rapid review of the available data and we submitted this report. And at that time, there were 250,000 adverse event reports on the yellow card system. And, I think that's probably like 1 in 100 or something per person vaccinated at that time. And there were 1,253 deaths. So what I did was break it down into types of disorders. So bleeding, clotting and ischemic, basically, neurological pain. There was a lot of pain, a lot of different sorts of pain. But the way that the yellow card system, the way that the UK government is presenting these data is that they're presenting them as PDF documents and listing all the different adverse reactions. And so there's and they don't use the same terminology or anything. So you get sort of 70 pages for the AstraZeneca, 70 pages for the Pfizer, and then Moderna and so on. And they just listed. So in order to extract these data, it's extremely difficult. It's not an Excel spreadsheet of it. So it seems like it's a deliberate attempt just to make the data not accessible. So it was with huge effort. And anyway, when we got the data, we sent it off. The conclusion of the paper, and you can find this paper. It wasn't published. We just published it on the website of our community interest company. But the conclusion was that the COVID vaccines are not safe for use in human beings, and that humanitarian efforts need to be commenced as soon as possible to ameliorate the medium to long-term effects. So, and that an independent audit needed to be done, and we offered to do this. So,
what was the response?
The response we got 7 weeks later to this urgent thing. I have to say that the JCVI didn't vote in favor of rolling it out to children. So that it did feel like we'd put our foot in the door just in time. And they didn't roll it out to children, but then they rolled it out to children some months later with the same level of evidence, basically no evidence to show that it's safe for children. Yeah. But in the response, Dr. June Ray says, some of these adverse reactions may be coincidental and may have occurred regardless of the vaccine. So, which is actually an interesting, it's an interesting admission that she says some. So the question is then, well, how many? Is it sort of 5%? Is it 50%? How many are coincidental? But it is an acknowledgement that some aren't coincidental. And is that 90%? So, the whole point is it was basically dismissed. And we did a follow-up report where we asked for it was included an FOI to say how many of the deaths have been followed up and how many of the cases of myocarditis have been followed up. And they couldn't answer that. They said this would take us too long to find out. And they've got a 24-hour cap or something on the amount of time they can spend on answering an FOI, a FOIA request, which is then interesting because you'd think if you've got 1,000 and then at the second report, 1,490 deaths, you'd think it would be a pretty quick task to say, okay, we've followed up 1,200 or something. You think you'd have a spread list of the ones followed up and the ones not followed up. should be really at hand, and so the fact that they couldn't answer that simple question really raised a lot of questions. And so there was then a subsequent FOIA request, in which case, where we asked, and when I say we, I'm using it broadly because it was a colleague, whether when the last safety audit of the MHRA data had been done. And it turned out they hadn't done one at all. And in actual fact, they are required by the Human Medicines Regulation to do a pharmacovigilance audit, safety audit every 2 years. So, and they haven't done, and we're in the middle, we were supposedly in a pandemic. So, it's really hugely incompetent at the very least.
Yeah, no, and I just want to kind of add a layer on that. Given all of that, what I don't understand and will never, ever understand is clearly there was a safety signal and clearly most people saw it. So given that, if there really was a belief somewhere that this thing was efficacious, but there was a safety signal, and of course there was a safety signal, why did they insist on doing a mass vaccination even for people who didn't need it? That's like if they'd taken that product and said, we're only going to use it on people over 85 or 80 who, whatever, the really people who were quite vulnerable to having a bad COVID outcome, I can maybe see, I could entertain maybe an ethical argument, maybe not, but it makes more sense. But that we've got to vaccinate everybody idea, even knowing what they knew, is that's very troubling for me.
No, well, even now, there's this ongoing push to vaccinate in spite of a mountain of data. The World Health Organization's VIGI Access Pharmacovigilance database has got more than 4 million reports of harms, more than 4 million. So, it's beyond the bounds of reason. So one really has to. I think we just have to move on. I think we just have to move on and say this is a runaway train, or there's nobody in the cockpit. There clearly had to have been an agenda, and the agenda was not to help people, protect them from getting COVID. The agenda was to get everybody injected and basically, it seems, onto this vaccine passport, which, the governments around the world are just pushing ahead with anyway, even though it doesn't make any sense at all to have a passport for a vaccine that doesn't even work, and that's harmful. So
I was spending some time, I did a show on this too, just pondering, I guess because, I was an investigative journalist. How do we prove it? How do we prove it? How much more do we need? How much data? And given that some of the deadly outcomes are spread across a whole bunch of physiological areas, right? It's a lot of it's heartsy and clotsy, but other stuff too. So I said to myself, this is how crazy I was getting. And I think good critically thinking can be driven crazy by this. And that what you just said about we got to move on is really, it's almost therapeutic for me, because I did a show where I was saying, like, if a tree falls in the forest and nobody sees, is it really happening? And what I meant by that was there appeared to be in the excess death data, lots of deaths that are either unexplainable and either COVID lockdown deaths or they're vaccine related deaths. But if the people doing the autopsies and the medical examiners are not categorizing them in a way that they're looking to see if they're vaccine related, we could be having a whole vaccine catastrophe happening and no way to measure it because doctors and medical examiners have not bought into the idea that vaccines are harmful. I mean, it's crazy when you think about it.
Yeah. So, but I do think that we do actually just, we need to just stick with the facts and not, because it's almost like one's playing playing their game. They, and I'm going to say they, from, I don't know if you've read 180 Degrees by Fergus O'Connor Greenwood. You mentioned not having the concentration span at the moment to read, but I think you'd find this quite gripping.
I'll order it today from Amazon.
It's a really great book. Don't get it from Amazon. Rather contact the author and get him to send you a copy.
Okay.
But it's unlearn all the lies you've been taught or something. So he says, but he has a very great acronym for they, because we talk about they, and then people say, "Oh, well, you're a conspiracy theorist. Who are they? Who are they? This they you're talking about?" Yeah. And he says they stands for the hierarchy exploiting you. And I love that because it really just explains everything, and it means you don't need to necessarily put a name to it, because we don't know really who is behind all of this.
Yeah, we don't. We don't.
Yeah.
We don't.
I mean, we suspect, we can certainly suspect, and some of them certainly do come out, the crazy ones like Klaus Schwab and Bill Gates, I'm afraid.
Yeah. Well, I heard even that Bill Gates is now advising Prince William, which was like awful to me. I thought maybe I could like Prince William, but the Earthshot Prize, he's taking advice from Bill Gates. So that's not a good look. Ugh, anyway.
So, we just have to say, look, guys, you can, stick your evil plan wherever you like, but we don't, we're not going to buy it. We're not interested. And we have to make a better plan. We have to actually, we have to decide now what sort of world we want to live in, because we basically all complicit. So this is the other thing, there's all this sort of anger going around on social media and in the other media, everyone's saying we've got to sort out this, we've got to get justice, and justice is going to take a long time coming. But, the first place to begin is actually to start with oneself and say, okay, well, how have I contributed to the position we're in now? We've contributed because we've supported these corporations. Because it's easy. We've had our things delivered by Amazon. We've go to these big supermarkets. We bought all this technology, and we've upgraded and signed all the forms without reading them, and still even read them and ticked the box and whatever. So we've actually given away our freedom and our sovereignty. And if we don't take it back now, then we're in big trouble.
Yeah, I'm with you. And I was sort of joking about Amazon, but only half, because I do use them when I need a book in a hurry. That's how they get you, right? I want to ask you, I know we're running out of time, so I'll keep it brief, but I was absolutely gobsmacked by the video you released about Andrew Hill. And I'm going to play it in the intro to this interview so people will have some idea what it was about. But I guess it speaks on two levels. It speaks on the research level for ivermectin, but it also speaks on a human level, because I guess you guys were friends, and there was real agony in that exchange. I could see it. I could see his, because it looked like he'd been kind of busted in a way. And I could see it in you kind of realizing something tragic had happened, and, maybe struggling to believe this person that you were working with had done this. So can we just talk about that briefly? So tell quickly the story of how that video came about.
Yeah, so I wouldn't say that we were friends. We were colleagues, newly acquainted colleagues who decided to work together, along with other very strong team of systematic reviewers, to produce a very robust systematic review, a Cochrane systematic review on ivermectin.
Yeah.
And before we could get to work on it, he published a really flawed review on a preprint server that actually turned out to really put a spoke in the wheel for the rollout of ivermectin, because it found a 75% reduction in deaths. But the conclusions were the authorities can't look at ivermectin papers until more trials are done. And so this effectively kicked the can for ivermectin down the road. In fact, so far down the road, we are where we are now. And there's just been, a whole lot of junk studies published by and influenced by Big Pharma to undermine the evidence on ivermectin. Yeah. So we have,
But he'd been on board with the 75%.
So he'd been on board, but he was my impression is that he was being played. And so his conclusions, so we had a meeting, because I said to him, look, your paper's going to cause immeasurable harm. Please retract it. And I said it's a bad paper anyway. I can help you. Let's do a good paper together. Mm-hmm. And then we had a Zoom meeting, and I recorded it. And in that meeting, he said, well, I asked who'd written his conclusions, because it wasn't what he'd been telling me. He'd been saying to me, look, let's get ivermectin approved as soon as possible. This is really exciting. And, we worked together. And he said, oh, my conclusions were influenced by my sponsor. And that, that's all very well if the sponsor is an acknowledged author and, is recognized, and that's sort of in the declarations, but there was none of that, and the sponsor was not. And then he was very cagey about who exactly had contributed, but he acknowledged that he would then still try and help get ivermectin approved as quickly as possible. And he said within the next 6 weeks, we'd be there with enough data. And interestingly, since then, a forensic communication consultant examined his paper and found that there were other voices in the paper that were not acknowledged. One was a non-English speaking person, and each entry by this person was to undermine the evidence on ivermectin. So there was a consistent thread, and it would be, so 75% reduction in deaths, but you can't trust this evidence because X, Y, Z. So,
and he never revealed who that voice was.
He never did, but there were some. The one name that he raised was Dominique Castigliola, and she worked for the French Medicines Regulatory Agency and was involved with remdesivir. Now, of course, remdesivir is another novel drug that should never have been approved for COVID, but there wasn't the evidence on it. Yeah. And she was one of the authors on that study. So clearly she had a conflict of interest. And the other author there's also since been an investigative journalist called Phil Harper, who's really dug into everything. And he came to me at the beginning of this year and he said, look what I found. And he looked at the properties of the PDF that had been put on the preprint server. And in actual fact, there was a Professor Andrew Owen who had been involved in checking that paper. So that was another potential person who may have contributed. And Professor Andrew Owen actually has a partnership in Tandem Nano, which is a lipid nanoparticle technology, and he received $40 million thereabouts from Unitaid, round about the same time, just before Andrew Hill's paper was published. So, so the plot really thickens, but certainly that was my first introduction to, oh, wow, this is...
cause and effect.
Yeah.
Yeah. And have you spoken to him since that video? Have you been...
Well, no, I mean, I obviously, when the 6 weeks were up last year after that conversation, I emailed him to say, so the 6 weeks are up, what now? And I didn't get a response. And then round about April, I emailed him again to say anything yet, please can we get ivermectin, approved now? And no response. And so in January this year, on the 18th, 1 year, to that meeting that we had, I emailed again and just said, look, so much has happened, so much harm has been done. Please come forward and reveal, who was putting pressure on you with that. And I got no response, which was why, we made that short documentary, because it just felt like time to reveal it, just say, well, look, and hopefully, get the message to the public that things are not as they seem,
Am I correct in, I'm going to let you go in a minute because I know you got to go, but am I correct when I watched that video that he admitted when you said how many people are going to die in this time period, that that he was looking for a number. Like was he actually admitting that people
he did look for a number. He said, around 15,000 people a day. Because I said, how many people are dying every day? He said, around 15,000 a day, And
so was that a tacit admission on his, not to put words in his mouth, but did you infer from that he was admitting that ivermectin would have saved those lives? Is that what we are to?
No, I don't think I can infer that, but he was, I certainly said, well, look, we could be saving these lives. So, 15,000 a day times 6 weeks is a lot of people who are going to die unnecessarily, because we know that ivermectin reduces deaths by 70 or 80%. So that was that. But in actual fact, I don't want to leave too soon, because I really want to leave on an up note.
Okay, well, let's do that then. Okay, because I was going to circle back after that to how do you want to end it, and how do you want us to look at the future after, I really say after this, 2 years plus, that we've all been traumatized. I feel traumatized because my world's been turned upside down. The pillars that uphold our democracy and government and medicine and journalism and science are not working on our behalf anymore. That's obvious. So I would love to hear something useful.
Yeah. Well, I would really like to share my perspective, because I don't feel traumatized. I feel optimistic and invigorated and excited about what the future holds, because I see we're at the brink of enormous change. And COVID has provided, all this corruption and whatever, this reveal of the deception, has provided this incredible opportunity for societal change that hasn't been available in the last 100, 200 years. So we're really having the opportunity to look at who we are, how we live, how we interact with each other, and think, is this the way we are meant to be, who are we really as human beings? And I think it's a wonderful opportunity to remember who we are, and that we're born in love. We love, we're joyful, and then we've spent basically most of our lives being made to be fearful. So we need to regain that sense of love and joy and wonder, and think about, if this whole world is crumbling down, then what sort of world do we want to live in, and how do we replace it? So, you may have heard Klaus Schwab and his cronies say call this the Great Reset. That we're having a Great Reset in the Fourth Industrial Revolution and all of that. It's pretty dystopian. The Fourth Industrial Revolution, where the product, the commodity, is the human being, and how much data you can extract from a human being, and so I would rather look at this instead of the Great Reset. I would rather call this the Great Free Set, and we've got this amazing opportunity to get out of this cage that we've been in. All these years, our entire lives, we've been run. So let's start rather choosing, actively, and being actively engaged in choosing, creating, a better way, and remembering what it means to be sovereign and free. We're born free, and somehow we give it all away. We actually are entitled, as long as we don't hurt anybody else, we are absolutely entitled to make our own decisions for the good of ourselves and for a higher good. So I would encourage. In actual fact, I don't know if you know about the Better Way Conference, but we had a conference in May called the Better Way Conference. It was held in Bath. It was in person and online, and you can watch it if you go to betterwayconference.org. There's a Bath one. There's a Vienna one as well, which was held more recently. The Bath one is available as all the presentations, and it was a very solutions-focused conference. And so we looked at how do you fix science, basically. How do you restore science? How do you manage the consequences of the COVID-19 chapter? How do we restore media credibility and journalist independence? How do we get people to actively engage in life and deciding their future and creating their future? How do we address environmental challenges? And how can we get the law to serve human rights? And then finally, how do we innovate new approaches to promoting health and taking care of ourselves? And out of that came the 7 principles of a better way. We sort of, what output do we need? We need something about what does this new world look like? And so the first principle of the better way is we act in honor and we do no harm. And this comes from natural law. It's a basic fundamental thing. If everyone just acts in honor and does no harm, we'd be 90% there, And then the number 2 is remembering that we are free beings with free will, and we actually take responsibility and control of our health, our lives, and our choices. We can't blame somebody else. We've been this very litigious society where something happens to you and then you sue somebody else for it. We are all, we're here to learn lessons. If something happens to you, you really have to look into yourself and solve whatever it is in yourself and take whatever happens as part of your personal journey. Yeah. We've got to stop this very sort of someone else is to blame for my problems, We're here to learn. So anyway, number 3 is we're part of nature. We're from nature. We're part of nature. We work together with nature, and we can't separate ourselves from. We and the planet need to be healthy. Yeah. Number 4 is spirituality is integral to our well-being, and we function best and we're happiest when we actually have a purpose in life. We have meaning to our lives. So we might have a transient pleasure by, buying something or eating something or whatever, but it doesn't sustain us. What sustains us is love. So in the most simplest form, one can think of spirituality as love, this quest for love. We all want to fall in love. That's spirituality. So even someone who says, well, I'm not spiritual, I don't go to church, or I don't, meditate or whatever, the very fact that we all need to be loved and we all want to love is spirituality, is the essence of it. Number 5 is we thrive together, and part of the success of the corporates and the WEF and governments is that they keep us divided and against each other all the time. So they just divide and divide and divide, and we've seen that with all these different movements, woke and the gender thing, and it's all designed to just keep splitting people up, So, let's just remember that actually the way we thrive is we love diversity and we collaborate and we're all different. We don't wish to be the same. We're all different and that's the way we like it, and we like to be together. And that's how we thrive. And then number 6 is we value different perspectives. So this is recognizing we don't all need to agree on anything. In fact, the way we learn and the way we develop and the way we refine our knowledge and wisdom is to bounce ideas off each other and to disagree and whatever, but it's best to do that in a really harmonious way, rather than, for this polarized kind of, oh, well, you're an anti this or an anti that or whatever, and labeling people and just because they held a different perspective to you. I mean, imagine if we all held exactly the same viewpoint. That would be very weird.
Yeah.
And then lastly, the importance of using technology with discernment. So, we recognize that technology used respectfully will enhance learning and wisdom to the benefit of people and the planet.
So you know what you did? So very funny. So 2 of those things you said, well, 3 of them actually I exhaled when you said them, right? One of them was the spiritual life. One of them was nature. I was like, oh yeah, okay. I should be outside in the trees. And the other one is discernment around technology. It's what's interesting about those. I'm in recovery for alcoholism. I have been for 22 years. And I'm in a 12-step program. And the 12 steps, which are fully life-changing for people who are pretty sick when they come in and end up spiritually happy and doing pretty well, they're not dissimilar from what you're talking about. You know, these are the rules for life, right?
Yes.
And and part of it, I think, too, is that we can't feel like we're going to control everything either. And we get in these pitched battles, as you just said, with people that we don't agree with, or maybe we are, you know, struggling with some of the trans extremism, which obviously I do because I think it hurts people, but I get too enraged about it. You know, you've got to kind of let go of some of that stuff and do your part in the way you can without being corrosive in your own self, right? So those sound great. I love those. Those are really good.
I think if something triggers you, this is something that we all need to work on. It's a constant process of refinement, actually, because when I was speaking about remembering who we are, you know, it's remembering that actually we're really loving, compassionate, trusting, joyful creatures, you know. But instead we end up acting like very, very unkind and
tribal.
And hostile. In fact, a tribal life is often very harmonious and peaceful. And
I just wanted to say that those are really important things for our listeners, because I hear from the people who listen to the show, it's been mostly COVID focused. We felt like we've been at war a bit for 2.5 years with our own, you know, Canada's been just the worst it's just awful. For Ontario, longest lockdowns, longest school closures, you know, still, we just got rid of our travel mandates like last week. I mean, it's brutal. But anyway, so we're struggling. So good news is good. Moving on is good. I love what you said about vaccines too. The data is there. We don't need 88 more studies to deal with this in an appropriate way. So thank you very much. You're a real inspiration, not just because you're fearless, but because you're trying to get through this with your emotional self and your spiritual life, and I'm assuming your family life too, intact. And that's a wonderful, wonderful example. Thank you so much. Very grateful.
Thanks very much. Yeah. Thanks, Trisha. Actually, I have just remembered what I wanted to say.
Please
and that was, you know, when things trigger you, when things trigger one, and it happens all the time, you know, be it something that makes you feel terribly sad or terribly angry or whatever, it's really an opportunity for growth. So that's when you really need to go into yourself and say, okay, why did I respond in that way?
Yeah.
Because it's not about the other person. We choose the way we respond in this life. We would choose how we show up. And so we have to constantly be improving ourselves, because you can't improve anybody else. You know, you can't change anybody else. You can just work on yourself and work towards getting into a more harmonious way of being.
Well, the thing I learned in the program is that we're not even allowed to have righteous anger. It's bad, even if it's for a good reason. You can't have it. So that's spiritually, that's the thing to overcome. You know, you're right, and it's maybe even defending another person, but you can't live in it. So we've got to start walking away a bit from some of this stuff. And I'm grateful you guys are thinking about it. Anyway, thanks for doing this.
Thank you so much.
Really grateful. Thank you. Bye. So that was a great Tess Lawrie, one of the bright lights of the COVID heretic movement. I shouldn't even really call it that. It's just scientists who have a different opinion and who were silenced or who paid a price for questioning, as science is supposed to, some of the public health and mandated policies that occurred during this period of our lifetime. It's really weird. And she seems like a very, very nice person. And I felt kind of bonded to her as mothers. You know, it's sort of difficult now to try and figure out what we would do with our kids in these circumstances. But we both said homeschool. So there you go. Okay, so I promised you a little bit of a reveal here about one of the people who has sent a letter to the Emergencies Act about his experience of the trucker convoy. As I said, he's a writer who reached out to me as a listener of the podcast. We had some nice exchanges. He sent me some books. I read them in a cabin in the woods, or one of them. Anyway, it was terrific. His name is Colin McAdam. Let me tell you about Colin McAdam. Colin McAdam, novelist born in 1971 in Hong Kong, best known for his novels Some Great Thing, Fall, and A Beautiful Truth. His work has also appeared in The Walrus, Harper's, and Granta, so he's a big deal. He's won the Paragraph Hugh McLennan Prize for Fiction and the Rogers Writers Trust Fiction Prize, and he teaches creative writing. His father, I think, was a diplomat. He spent part of his childhood and adolescence living in China, Denmark, England, and Barbados, as well as a number of Canadian cities. He attended Ashbury College, which is the big private school in Ottawa, a boarding school in Ottawa, it says. And in 1989, he moved to Montreal, where he completed an undergraduate degree at McGill University with a major in English and a minor in classics. He then studied Renaissance literature at the University of Toronto, where he graduated with a master's degree in English literature in 1994. In 1995, McAdam moved to England to begin his PhD at Cambridge. He studied 17th century Renaissance translations of Greek and completed his dissertation, Greek translations of the Interregnum. I don't even know how to pronounce that. Gosh. 1642 to 1660, kind of arcane, in 1998. Shortly after receiving his PhD, McAdam moved to Australia, where he worked as an editor at a legal publishing house for several years. So no dummy, no hillbilly, well-born, well-educated, terribly smart, and a very good writer, and someone who has watched our country going down the tubes during the COVID-19 crisis, and not because of the virus. Not because of the virus, because of the policies that were brought to bear on the country by the feds and the provinces. And what's interesting about Colin is that he's one of the few kind of creative literati types in the country who has spoken out on this side of the debate. You'll recall I interviewed Ann Bauer, who is a big essayist in the States, and she brought, as does Colin, the artist's eye to this issue. So they really see through a lot of the stuff that others don't, and they write and speak about it in ways that are hugely important for our time. So I'm going to read you the letter he wrote to the Emergencies Act Commission. And then after that, we're going to listen to a couple of lovely little crafted odes to the convoy. So here we go. To whom it may concern. I am writing as a member of the public in order to voice my opinions, my dismay about the declaration of the Emergencies Act in response to the convoy last February. I live in Chelsea, Quebec, a short drive from Parliament, and last February I drove to the Hill on the day the convoy began arriving. I was curious. My family, like millions of others, had endured some of the most stringent, intrusive, authoritarian measures over the previous 2 years, especially in Quebec, of anywhere in the world. I had lost my income. My wife and I were isolated and depressed. Our daughter, normally a force of energy and enthusiasm, was lonely, despondent, angry. She couldn't see friends, couldn't go to school, and was told to cover her face and view her friends not as people, but as vectors of disease. Over those 2 years, I had done my best to inform myself of the nature of COVID-19, whom it killed, how, and why. A disease that overwhelmingly harmed only those who were already very ill, whose mortality rate is comparable to that of the flu, a disease which, it is now abundantly clear, withstands whatever benefits these mandated vaccines were meant to impart to those who are healthy and eager to contribute to society. Many people I knew had been infected. My family and I had been infected, all while doing our best to obey rules and forfeiting our natural need for company for friends. Our experience was by no means unique. What I saw play out in Canada was an alarming division between those who could continue to work, to draw income, to stay at home and enjoy more time with their families, and those like me who could not pivot. People who owned gyms and restaurants, musicians, people who relied on entrepreneurialism, on creativity, on service, on the individual energy that makes cities and countries interesting, found themselves the victims of arbitrary decisions about what was, in quotes, essential. It is a division that has only increased and will no doubt continue to. I have a PhD from Cambridge University. I am an award-winning novelist. I have lived all over the world and have been a student of history for decades. Like many, I was disheartened to see my charter rights completely ignored or trampled. Freedom of assembly, freedom of movement, and perhaps, most importantly, freedom of speech. After 2 years of miserable and unnecessary restrictions and mandates, a group of truckers rallied to have their voices heard. We were told that these were ill-informed, bigoted, anti-science ignoramuses who did not deserve our tolerance. On the first day, I did not see these caricatures I was meant to expect. I saw people like me, but from all walks of life and from many different places across the country who have endured 2 very long years of divisive and ineffective mandates. People I may not have had a lot in common with in superficial ways, but people whom I, as a human being and Canadian, have an inescapable connection and social obligation to. We speak all the time in Canada about tolerance and diversity, about caring for the vulnerable, and these are things I believe deeply. None of this language was at play as these truckers began to arrive. Were these not the people who most deserved our tolerance? Those who lost their livelihoods because of arbitrary and mostly inappropriate calculations about a respiratory virus? The man who opened a yoga studio when the pandemic began, forced to close it because it was not essential, forced to sell his house to support himself. The mother whose son died because he couldn't join his hockey team without being vaccinated, who was killed by the vaccine and would likely have otherwise experienced COVID as a cold. It's not our role as Canadians to tolerate, in quotes, these people, to be Is it not our role as Canadians to tolerate, in quotes, these people, to be curious about their stories, to listen? Understand the word tolerate as he's using it is a reference to our Prime Minister saying they shouldn't be tolerated. The reality for me as I walked down Wellington Street on that first day was a sense of uplifting joy. Of course, there was an element of protest, of frustration, but people were overwhelmingly and openly connecting, shouting words of love, perhaps not to the Prime Minister, but to each other. It was a sunny day, -30, and it seemed to me that this was actually summer, a day of hope after a 2-year winter. The atmosphere was so joyful, so energizing, that I brought my wife and daughter the next day when thousands more people gathered, people of every description, families, groups of Indigenous singers, many races, and of course, drunk and Carhartt-wearing truckers, in quotes, who were shouting, "I love you," to everyone. Tellingly, I noticed no media that day, no one reporting on this crowd of thousands, no one looking for stories. At night, I watched coverage on CBC and CTV, and the angles they chose, the facts, again in quotes, and incidents they reported were sickening to me. Completely unrepresentative of what my family and I had seen with open eyes. Completely ignorant of the irrefutable ethos of those days, which was one of joy, of people wanting to connect again. And of course, it played out as it did. The divisions deepened, the misreporting grew, and all of it culminated in this upsetting act of government overreach, the use of the Emergencies Act, and the freezing of bank accounts. That last act alone should send chills through every thinking Canadian. If we support a cause that a government declares unacceptable, our bank accounts can be frozen, our reputation ruined. I find that terrifying. What was it disruptive? Were some of the protesters unseemly? Were there moments of discomfort and voices that some didn't agree with? These are the inescapable consequences of democracy, of acknowledging that the world, our country, truly is diverse, and that from that diversity come voices we sometimes don't like to hear. I deeply believe that a government does not have the right to decide which of us has the right to speak. We have had the right as private citizens to plug our ears or summon the fortitudes to listen. I no longer feel able or comfortable making my voice heard in this country for fear that my life and livelihood could be ruined. That is a deep and real assault to my charter rights. Putting these very words down, regardless of their inconsequence, has been an act I've thought twice about. And I find that pitiful. Thank you for your attention. Colin McAdam. So we are lucky to have a writer of that caliber, a thinker of that caliber, speaking out. And hey, Margaret Atwood, where are you? You know, I wish more of them would do it. I'm going to do a little pitch on his new book, too, called Black Dove, a new novel by Colin McAdam, Giller Prize nominee and winner of the Rogers Writers' Trust Fiction Prize, featuring a performance by Kathleen Edwards. That's what happened at the book. I was invited. I didn't go. I couldn't go because I've got so much stuff happening in my life. But yeah, so Colin McAdam and Kathleen Edwards in the same room. Wow. So that's an act of courage, because you and I both know that in the world in which he lives, of the creative artists in this country are mostly on the other side, or if they aren't, they don't have the courage to speak up, right? So my props to my new friend, Colin McAdam, for doing that. Now, before I move to the couple little pieces of tape I wanted to play for you, I've got bad news. And then I'll leave you with something inspiring. But the bad news is that, and you probably already know this by now too, because it's happening now and this show is airing a week later, but that Sean Rickard and Carl D. Harrison issued a statement on October 20th saying that the lawsuits by Brian Peckford, Maxime Bernier, and someone else whose name I don't know, sorry, are struck by the mootness motion, including theirs, by the way. So I just want to read a little bit of that. Fighting Trudeau's discriminatory vaccine mandate for travel. Update 20 October 2022. Federal Court Docket T1991-21. Sean Rickards and Carl Harrison versus the Attorney General. Today we received the judgment of the Assistant Chief Justice Jocelyn Gagné in relation to the motion by the Attorney General to dismiss our case as being moot. Justice Gagné has agreed with the Attorney General that the issues are moot and has dismissed our case. She has also dismissed the other three cases, including the applications by Maxime Bernier and Brian Peckford. This does not mean that the court has made a judgment against our challenges. Justice Gagné has simply refused to hear the pleadings or look into the evidence. So the media may spin this a different way. Oh, on the merits, it was... No, they didn't hear the merits. They declared it moot. Excuse me. And my understanding of moot means that a circumstance has changed, so the judgment would be irrelevant now, which of course is complete nonsense, because we're heading back into mandates, very, very likely. That's my sense. At least they're trying, they're ginning it up. So that is bad news. I didn't like to hear that. And it really makes me feel like there is an element of corruption here. Wow, if we can't win in the courts, what rights do we have? Government's handed all of our rights over to public health officials, some of whom aren't very bright, to be honest. How do we fight back? Then we have a protest that the media doesn't cover, so the protest isn't bad. I mean, this is really bad, and I was quite upset when I read it. Okay, so I want to leave you with some uplifting sounds today. Just kind of if you're out walking and listening to me on a headset somewhere, this is maybe you can pick up the pace a little bit here, because you don't have to do too much thinking. All you have to do is listen to these lovely words by One of them is by a member of the European Parliament. Her name is Christine Anderson. I played her on the show before. She says great things about the vaccine. She's really ballsy. And then we will also hear in closing, we'll go from that clip and then we'll fade into Carlo Maria Spigiano, who is the Apostolic Nuncio, which means he's a Catholic archbishop, cheering on the truckers. We all heard this at the time, but these little pieces of tape have a special resonance for us all now. Doesn't it seem long ago? Wow, how down we were and how uplifted then we were by the truckers and Tamara Leach and Chris Barber, people I had on the show quite a bit and who I became quite fond of. I suppose that's not very objective reporting, but I was fond of them. I think they did a real public service, regardless of what the fools in Ottawa are saying and the people in the town of Ottawa who seem to be the most snowflakey in the whole world. My goodness, if Black Lives Matter was raising a fuss, they'd be out there raising their fists. But they were afraid of working class people. And so they invented these ridiculous stories that we're hearing at the Emergencies Act hearing, including now having really important people signed in and wrote saying, well, I didn't know that for sure. I just read it in the media. Given how much the media lies now, and certainly lied about the convoy. So really, are you telling me that you were making policy and deploying the police against the convoy because of stuff you were reading in the Ottawa Citizen or seeing on Global TV who did that terrible arson report? Really? Oh, just awful. So I think what we need to do is just kind of refresh for ourselves how important that was and how, look at this is the European Parliament and an Italian archbishop, right? Talking about the Canadian truckers. We made an impact around the world and the globalists didn't like it and they shut it down, but let the spirit live on and stay critical.
The global coup that in these 2 years has been carried out by the globalist elite appears more clearly if you do not limit ourselves to considering what happened in individual nations, but broaden our gaze to what has happened everywhere. Your protest, dear Canadian truck driver friends, joins a worldwide chorus that wants to oppose the establishment of the new world order on the trouble of nation states through the Great Reset designed by the World Economic Forum and by the United Nations under the name of Agenda 2030. And we know that many heads of government have participated in the Klaus Schwab's School for Young Leaders, the so-called Global Leaders for Tomorrow. It would seem that Canada is, along with Australia, Italy, Austria and France, one of the nations most infiltrated by the globalists. You understood this instinctively, and your yearning for freedom was shown in all its coordinated harmony, moving towards to the capital, Ottawa. Dear truck drivers, you are facing great difficulties, not only because you give up your work to demonstrate, but also because of this adverse weather condition, long night in the cold, and attempts to be clear away that you face. But along with these difficulties, you have also experienced the closeness of many of your fellow citizens who, like you, have understood the looming threat and want to support you in protesting against the regime. Allow me also to express to you my support and my spiritual closeness, to which I join the prayer of your event may be crowned with success and may also extend to other countries. In this day, we see the mask of tyrant from all over the world fall, and unfortunately we also see so much conformism, so much fearfulness, so much cowardice in people who up until yesterday we regarded as friends, even among our family members. Yet, precisely because of this extreme situation, we discover with amazement gestures of a humanity made by strangers, signs of solidarity and brotherhood on the part of those who feel close to us in the common battle. We discover so much generosity, so much desire to shake us from this stupor. We discover that we are no longer willing to passively suffer the destruction of our world imposed by a cabal of unscrupulous criminals, thirsty for power and money. In this relentless attack on the traditional world, not only your way of life and your identity have been affected, but also your possession, your activities, and your work. This is the Great Reset. This is the future promised by the slogan like Build Back Better. This is the future of billions of people being controlled in their every move, in all their transactions, in every purchase, every bureaucratic practice, every activity. Automatons without soul or will, deprived of their identity, reduced to having a universal income that allows them to survive, to buy only what others have already decided to put up for sale. Today, more than ever, it is essential that you realize that it is no longer possible to passively assist. It is necessary to take a position, to fight for freedom, to demand respect for natural freedoms. But even more, dear Canadian brothers, it is necessary to understand that this dystopia serves to establish the dictatorship of the New World Order and totally erase every trace of our Lord Jesus Christ from society, from history, and from the tradition of peoples. Demonstrate for your right, Canadian friends, but may this right not be limited to a simple claim to the freedom to enter supermarkets or not to be vaccinated. May it also be a proud and courageous claim to your sacrosanct right to be free men. The truth will make you free. And may God bless you all.